Thank you for joining us today. It's August 17th, and we are going to be chatting about neurodiversity and going back to school and what it means to be prepared. So we put a list of panelists together who are experts in transitioning from lower elementary to upper elementary, and from elementary in general to middle school, and then of course from middle school to high school. So this is a really important topic because especially for those parents who have 504s, IEPs, moving from public school to private to public, whatever combination that essentially you're working on, that is essentially what's on the table today. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So today in the parent webinar series, we're going to introduce our new experts. You're going to meet some of them. Some of them you've already known, and they're, seeing us again, which is great. And then we do have a live audience Q&A session as well. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through the list of questions that were asked prior to the webinar by parents. We're going to go through those. We've had those ranked, and those are the most popular ones. If there's time, we will absolutely answer the questions live. But say if we run out of time, we will still publish a blog answering those questions, or we will personally email you answering those questions. Just remember that the questions that might take priority are the ones that are more generic than, maybe say specific. But again, don't let that stop you. Just go ahead and ask the question. You never know what's going to stick and what's not going to stick. For all our Arizona folks, we're ESA approved, and we will talk about what we do as we go along. So Learnfully was actually started, with the intention of helping neurodivergent learners. So we started in January of 2021. And at that time, the most popular number, of course, was, hey, 1 in 5 learners have been diagnosed with a learning difference. But the big thing that people don't really know is the undiagnosed number is large. And when we did a huge survey, we found that 45% of caregivers actually think that their learners either have a diagnosis or definitely have a learning difference, but are yet to be diagnosed. So the point is, this is not a minor special education thing anymore. Every kid learns differently, and we're essentially here to, help not only the learners, but also help schools and more importantly, families understand what it takes for a neurodivergent kid to thrive and also be the best version of themselves. And of course, during COVID, everything blew up, and Understood.org did a survey and found that 72% of caregivers believe that their child is neurodiverse and have no idea what to do. And of course, if you look at educators, when we did a giant survey, we found that 87% of gen ed educators have had neurodiverse learners in their classroom. So the theme that you're seeing over here is that it's more prevalent that we think or that we know. And the danger is how little we know and what we assume about neurodivergent kids. And so some of you might be wondering, what is executive dysfunction? We're going to get into that when Sheila essentially takes over. So yeah, so I'm Suchi. I'm the founder and CEO of Learnfully. I used to work in the tech industry, and then a few years in, I started having kids. They started getting diagnosed with ADHD, and then I got diagnosed with ADHD, which totally made sense because my younger kid has ADHD, and so do I. So I have 2 boys, and this was a passion project that started somewhere around 2017, and in 2021, we knew it was time because the big realization was the world is not necessarily ready for kids who are in that gray zone. Schools are emerging, but they're still learning. And so we're here to essentially demystify that. And then with us, we have Dr. Sheila Murphy. She is our SVP of Education and Ops. My favorite story is she is a mom of 3 boys. And, I think I tell the story better than she does, which is why I'm taking it for her. She's a mom of 3 boys and, realized that her kids were getting diagnosed. They were, with dyslexia or, ADD. and was very frustrated by the school system. And of course, she got her PhD in education well after, they were in school. So the fact that, what motivators our families can be is very inspiring. But at the same time, we are also here because we're trying to help, families. So you don't have to go through the same thing that, hopefully, we went through. So with that, I'm going to hand it to you, Sheila.
Thank you. Yeah, I am Sheila Murphy. My 3 sons were diagnosed with ADD and dyslexia, dysgraphia when they were early on in their education. I was constantly trying to figure out resources. I was a stay-at-home mom at the time without a college degree. I tried to help the teachers every year as we went on to navigate resources, accommodations, modifications for my own kids, and then decided I really wanted to go into education to help the system, because I then understood that parents are all flailing, educators are flailing, trying to understand how to best support their learners. And so, yeah, I think in an effort to prove to the world that I wasn't dumb like I thought I was, because my own undiagnosed dyslexia and ADHD at the time when I was going through school, I did get 4 degrees in 10 years because I really wanted to forge a path in this field of support for neurodiverse learners. So that's why I ended up here.
Awesome. So yeah, this is just a little quote I like to start with. It says, "Strength lies in differences and not in similarities." So it's very important to find a way to embrace your differences and then see them, use them as strengths. For example, for ADHD, like you can easily say that, oh my God, she does not pay attention, or, seems to be thinking about different things. But the reality is, what I'm actually doing is that I'm probably, not just me, but anyone with ADHD are putting things together very quickly. So what I saw as a big weakness actually ended up being, a strength in in a different way. And so, but looking at it that way is what really helped me change my perspective on me and how I do things. And similarly, it's very important for kids to have that conversation of, this is a difference, it's not less than. And that's essentially what we try to go for. With that, I'm just going to hand it off to Sheila here, where, we talked about executive functioning, and we really want to go into more detail over here.
Yeah, so we wanted to go into detail about executive functioning because we really truly believe it's an underutilized area in the education system. So 100% of students, if they have a diagnosis, have an executive dysfunction in one or more areas. In addition to the students with diagnoses, there's another minimum of 25%. So 45% of any given classroom has students that struggle with executive dysfunctions. So we think it's really important for families to understand, and learners and educators as well, to understand what are the executive functioning skills and how do they affect education. So basically, executive functioning skills are our control center. As adults, we use them all day long, every day, from the minute we wake up until the minute we go to bed. These are the 11 areas that they control. So you can see attention, impulse control, self-monitoring, organization, time management, planning, prioritization. These are all areas that we use throughout the day to get ourselves ready for work, to get our kids ready for school, to get ourselves out the door, driving, without maybe saying a lot of 4-letter words to the driver next to us in impulse control. So this is the part of your brain that controls everything you do throughout the day. The reason it's really important is that any student that is struggling with learning in any way is having some sort of dysfunction. So it's like getting to the root problem. We're not just putting Band-Aids on things. We're getting to the root of why they are struggling with reading, writing, math, any of these things. that they're struggling with academically that can all be rooted in one of these executive functioning skills. So that's the importance. No, that's okay. It's okay. You can move forward. Anyway, one of the things that I'm actually here doing today at a school in Palo Alto is that we are doing our executive functioning professional development. This was us last week, where we had people say it's the best PD they've had in the 12 years at the school. These are just some of the quotes that we got. We have been doing this because we believe so deeply in executive functioning that we want to provide the knowledge to teachers so that they're empowered with understanding not just how a student learns and why, but why they struggle and how to support them if they are struggling. So one of the things we do, we go into schools, we do professional development, help support the teachers. We also coach teachers if they have specific students that they're struggling with. We coach families if the families are having challenges. And then we also do one-on-one services or small group services for learners. We believe it takes a village, and this is how we ensure the village is all educated, speaking the same language, getting the same tools, accommodations, recommendations, strategies, and activities, so that we can ensure success for students. So what you're going to get to hear about today is that we have 3 experts that are going to talk about going into the school year. How to ensure success for your learners from lower to elementary to upper elementary, from elementary to middle, and then middle to high school. So these are kind of some areas that we believe are the areas that are within schools at this time. So learning to read from lower to upper elementary and upper elementary, you go from learning to read to reading to learn. So that's a transition that happens within an elementary school. For middle school, you have the emerging independence. You're learning to advocate for themselves. And then if you're going from middle to high school, there's a lot of independence and again, advocating for themselves. So these are things that we hope to see in students, but sometimes it's not innate. They need supports in these areas.
Awesome, thank you. So as Sheila mentioned, that what you can expect from this webinar is you will be interacting with education experts. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat. If I'm looking that way, it's because I'm trying to look for the questions and sort of coordinate. So yeah, with that, let's get started. We did have a small change in our schedule. Dr. Murphy actually had to get pulled into another professional development. So we have Rachel, again, who's been with us with Learnfully since day one, who essentially is going to be taking over. So Rachel is an education specialist at Learnfully. She is also an EF coach and has had 20+ years of education experience with both neurodistinct, neurotypicals, and essentially neurodivergent learners. Dr. Tera Shamey, thank you for joining us. She is our guest. She brings 25 years of experience in education spaces and is very passionate about improving learning outcomes. Giulia is with Learnfully, and she essentially is our advocate for young adults, who have learning differences or are neurodivergent. She comes to us with a vast breadth of knowledge, both as a neurodivergent and also someone who wants to coach other neurodivergent kids to become best versions of themselves. So without further ado, Rachel, why don't you go ahead and get started?
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me on today. I'm glad to be a part of the webinar. So just a little bit about myself and my experience. I've been a special educator for over 20 years. Definitely have dealt a lot with and just have a vast experience working with neurodivergent learners with autism, dyslexia, and executive dysfunction for sure. I've worked in a wide range of settings, anywhere from your traditional brick and mortar to charter schools and virtual. Right now, I'm currently a manager of ed services with Learnfully, working with neurodiverse learners and our neurotypical learners as well, focusing on, bringing in that executive function support, specializing instruction, and building relationships with our families and our learners. So, goodness, what do I consider my impact right now? I think it is majorly, I just really want to support neurodiverse learners and really have a focus on multisensory instruction, but tying into building relationships and that rapport with our learners in order to best support them. And then I really just love connecting with families and providing support to support the child as a whole in any environment. Why do I do what I do today? I really just have a passion for meeting individual needs with really specialized programming. I really love connecting with educators, parents, and supporting neurodiverse learners. And then it's really important for me to make sure that I foster those relationships. I provide voice and choice for our learners, and then of course support their independence as they move through their program. So what I want you to know, I'm just kind of relating to our topic of back to school. One of the things I really was kind of reflecting on today was that back to school is not really a solvable problem, but something that we can set and put forth strategies and systems to help ease that transition, right? There's no magic pill. We just really need to encourage our learners and support, and we'll talk about that as they transition from environment to environment, back to school. And just one thing, if I can just help everyone here, it's just to make sure you have compassion on yourself as you work through this as a parent. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Shamey, back to you. Oh, are you on mute?
I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Tera Shamey. I've been an educator since the mid-90s, and I currently serve as a senior director for school improvement for Detroit Public Schools. So I am far removed now from where students are, because the further you get from that classroom, the bigger the district becomes, the further you get from kids. Prior to that, I was a director of curriculum instruction and assessment. And prior to that, I taught for 22 years. I taught in many different contexts. I've taught in charter schools, I've taught in public schools, I've taught middle school, elementary school. And most of my experience, I come at this from a general ed perspective. I've been a general ed teacher. I'm an administrator with a doctorate in K-12 curriculum and instruction. But throughout my whole career, I've always had neurodivergent students in my classroom. I think that number in the beginning, the 87%, the teachers that report that 87% of them have had students in their room, I think it's probably closer to 100, and they just haven't quite realized it yet. And I don't think I realized it going through my career. And so transitioning to the impact piece of that in the classroom, it wasn't because I was a special ed teacher or trained, because I wasn't. As a teacher, I never once had any training in any kind of anything related to neurodivergence, anything related to special education. And there was always a general sense that it was someone else's job. But for me, the impact was who was in my room. And so seeing every single kid and knowing that every single one of them needed something from me, whether they were neurodiverse, whether they were a typical kid, they all needed something to feel comfortable. And so my impact throughout my almost 30 years now is advocating for marginalized students and really trying to support educators to see that classrooms don't look like they always did. They're not going to, and that's okay. Classrooms aren't going to be the way they were when we were children. They're never going to look the same way. And it's really hard to sort of break out of that idea that kids are going to sit and stay in this mold. And often teachers become teachers because they want to give that back. They want to give what they had back to students, but 20 years later, 30 years later, it doesn't exist. And so being able to work with teachers to say, it's okay, give yourself permission to let your classroom look different, to let your classroom be louder than you're used to, or have more activity than you're used to. And so as an administrator, it's easier to do that because often teachers are looking for that permission. So my impact, aside from also being quite involved outside of work in social justice, particularly with racism and ableism, like working with seclusion and restraint and trying to stop that particular practice. I live in a community that is known for seclusion and restraint and is still building seclusion and restraint rooms in brand new schools. So my impact in that way is about advocating for every single student that needs an advocate in order to be successful. And why do I do what I do? If I had an answer to that question, it would just be that I was born into this family of, number one, they're all educators. My parents, teachers, my sisters are all teachers. So I was not ever going to be a teacher. That was not what I wanted to do, but just teaching was just who I was. And so it found me, not the other way around. And I do what I do now because I see that school isn't working for kids. So, and it's not just neurodivergent kids, but the structures of school aren't working largely for most of our students. And so I continue on this path of advocacy for kids because we have to shift the structures of our schools and our classrooms so that we can start to meet the needs of more of our learners.
That's awesome. Awesome. So I think in a way you also answered what I want you to know. So let's just go directly to Giulia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Giulia. So as mentioned, I am an ed spec. My experience is like very based in my own experience being a neurodivergent person. My diagnosis story like really motivates me. Again, like having that experience of being neurodiverse is something I pull from a lot. In addition to that, I do have experience with teaching high school English, as well as researching a master's degree in education where I researched disability theory and ethnic studies, which also shapes a lot of what I do. I would say that my impact is really working from a relationship-centered and SEL perspective. I work with all my learners to kind of define values and then to see how these values operate in our lives and to make sure that the learning that we're doing and the way that we are showing up for ourselves in and out of school is very aligned with those values, you know, adding purpose to all of these amazing things that we're having these people do. And the reason I do what I do is because, well, I think it's really important to me that I'm able to see and connect with kids in the way that I wish I had been seen and connected with as a young person who was largely undiagnosed throughout high school. And what I want you to know, I would say for this particular, there's so much that I want you to know, but for this particular webinar, I would say like trusting honesty. I think that sometimes like in conversations about disability, there is a lot of hesitancy towards honesty. And it's like, okay, but if we're honest with these kids, maybe they'll be upset. And I urge you to challenge that and to instead see honesty as empowering and as liberating, right? You're empowering these kids with understanding what they're working with. And that will allow for a shift of blame from internal to something more external, more solution focused.
Giulia, I think I'm stressing on this mostly because it's an important point. Would you mind telling us what being honest is? Like, would you mind expanding on that?
Yes, of course, I'd be so happy to. So for me, I wasn't very sure about my diagnosis for most of high school and middle school as well. It was sort of like that was at the time when there was like, oh, it's borderline, it's not really an issue. And I just started blaming myself. I was like, okay, it's my fault. Like a metaphor I like to use is that I was treading water when everybody else was just standing. So I was able to keep up. I was able to get the grades that I wanted, but the personal cost, my energy cost, my relationship with myself, all of these things were shattered. However, when I was in college, I received my official diagnosis, and it was a moment where, it was so cathartic because I had realized, when I saw my diagnosis and I saw what ADHD encompassed, that it was not just being distracted at school, it was sensory processing, emotional regulation, ability to like be persistent in relationships. And when I saw all of that laid out in front of me, I almost felt like this like stress balloon deflating. And I was like, okay, this is why I've been struggling with these things. It's not a personal failure, but instead an other obstacle that I have to work with. And when we really hide this from our children, they know they are already having a hard time, right? But when we choose to be honest with them, we allow them to understand a little bit more about their struggles and to stop internalizing it so much.
Thank you so much. I know the intros took a little longer, but I promise you it's going to be worth it. We have about 9 questions. Like I said, if you don't get your question answered, please put it in the chat. Worst case, you'll get an email or you'll get a blog with the answer from us. So I'd love to start with Rachel. So one thing before I move on to Rachel is you'll notice that the question is, it's probably going to be repeated 3 times, but just kind of keep in mind that the context is different. The first one is transitioning from lower to upper. The second one's going to be elementary to middle. And then the third one's going to be middle to high. So you're going to see this repeat 3 times. So with that, Rachel, the first question, of course, is how should I prepare my child for the new school year while transitioning from lower to upper elementary school?
All right, thank you. Yes, couple of different ways that I just suggest, preparing your child. When we're looking at this age level, one thing that really comes to mind is with front loading. Okay, front loading is essential. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a couple of different things that I would recommend in order to support this transition. One of those things could be visit the school or the classroom, especially if you're moving from one location to another, or even the classroom. Visit the school. And definitely, another thing you could integrate are those pictures and diagrams that can help with the school layout for orientation. This can help with that transition just from that practical sense. Talking and empowering your learner is also very important as you transition and prepare for school. You could take the things that they're worried about and then just manufacture the opportunity to practice those things before school starts. If I can give an example, if a child is worried about who is their teacher going to be or what is that schedule going to look like, making those contacts, having a meet and greet with the teacher, seeing what the schedule layout is going to be ahead of time, and actually creating even something like a visual to support that transition could really help learners with that. It's really important to have that prep ahead of time. I know that it's kind of something we see all over the place as we get back to school, but adjusting that sleep schedule. And for our learners with neurodiversity, it is really extremely important to work on that component. And then practice and create opportunities to try the new thing before school starts. Maybe that's getting that backpack ready, or it's, okay, we've got to prepare, this folder or this organization, but doing that preparation ahead of time is really important. Something that I've done a little bit of research on, and I've done a little bit of this with my own children, is how to slow that transition. For example, practicing that morning routine the week before school starts. One suggestion is even driving to the parking lot, if that's the case where you're driving your learner. But those are just some practical things that you can really do to help support those transitions.
That is so true. Like even when my kids were younger, it was really important to do that. But I think more importantly, it was also very important to understand what the hangups were, if you will. So
Yes.
I often got that information from last year's teacher or from their therapist or, whatever we had access to. So just tuning into that. So like I have an engineering brain, that's my degree. So I'm always wondering, like, what is the problem? What is the cause? And I think that essentially saved us in a lot of situations. So instead of just jumping and reacting, I would say spend the time, trying to understand the exact problem, because every kid is different. I completely agree. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Shamey, same thing. How should I prepare my kid for the new school year while transitioning from upper elementary to middle school?
There we go. Sorry, I did it again. The transition to middle school is one of the hardest things that students and families have to experience. And I was a 6th grade teacher for many of my years. And so 6th graders are my people. And giving them what they need is something that I had a lot of experience doing. But as I was listening to the elementary pieces and the things that kids need to focus on, with middle school, it is the most overwhelming thing. And so I wrote down these things: the structure of the day, the lockers. Your middle schooler and is going to be stressed about opening up a locker. getting a schedule with 7 teachers, having 7 teachers and navigating 7 different places and 7 sets of rules and guidelines, those things are overwhelming. What I want to say to any parent listening and any teacher is that every single kid is overwhelmed by that structure. So your child is not alone. And so giving grace to yourself and to your children is the number one thing that you can do for their success, because it is across the board a stressful experience. I do a lot of data disaggregation and collection, and the number of suspensions in 6th grade and 9th grade are usually about quadruple the suspensions of the other grade levels in those buildings. And I would attribute that to that transition and just being a fish out of water in a space where, okay, suddenly I was 10, I had 1 teacher, and now I'm 11 and I have 7. And so a couple suggestions I would make is finding for every kid, in order to be able to advocate for themselves, find that teacher that you can talk to, that you feel comfortable with, to say, you know, like, here's what happened in 4th hour. How do I do this? Or I can't get to my locker. What do you suggest? Finding that one adult, whether it's a counselor, a teacher, a parapro, somebody in the building that you can ask those questions of is important. But know that it's going to be overwhelming. I'm going to tell this really quick story. In my last few years as a 6th grade teacher, we would have curriculum night just like everybody else, and everybody would give a syllabus. Like, teachers would give a syllabus to parents, like for 11-year-olds, and by the time they would get to me, they're overwhelmed. They've got a stack of papers and they're waiting for me to hand them all the papers. And although I'm a curriculum person, I have a doctorate in curriculum, I did not share with them a syllabus or anything I was planning to teach. I put a picture of my nephews up on the wall on the projector, and I just said, what you can expect is I'm going to treat your babies the way I expect my nephews to be treated every day when they walk into school. And I would see on their faces, parents would cry at just hearing that piece, like that connection piece. And that's what they need. So for teachers, if you're listening to this and you're a teacher, know that they just need to hear that you're going to take care of their baby, their 11-year-old child who is entering this massive world that is very difficult to transition. And then a couple of the other things that middle school kids struggle with a lot are going to the bathroom and lunch. They are so hard. And just talking through those things with them and having a plan because you get like these 5 minutes between classes. Well, 5 minutes when you're 11 is nothing when you got to go to your locker, go to the bathroom, get your stuff, and then get to your next class, which might be on the other side of the school. And so walking them through all of that, making a plan for the day would be really helpful. Being able to get into the school and go through the schedule, like where are all your classes? When's the best time to go to your locker? How do you, what do you need to take 1st hour, 2nd hour, 3rd hour, and how can you organize that in a way that limits your transition? So, but know that everybody is struggling with that entrance into 6th grade. It's so hard, but it can be easier if you just have a little bit of grace and give yourself some space.
And as adults, like, I've completely forgotten middle school and the experience. So it's so true. You do go from, I'm sitting in one classroom, to wait, now what? Especially in a new school, not even the same campus. So that is such an important reminder. Thank you for that. Giulia, same question, but transitioning from middle to high school. What should I do to prepare my child for the new school year?
Of course. So I want to just echo what Dr. Shamey said, like, absolutely, stress is, it is a transition. I think in high school, it feels that's when grades get real, of course, because everybody's so stressed about college. I have 9th graders that are like, okay, when do I start like preparing for this? And because of that stress, like, these grades, again, weigh so much more, like they have so much more weight for these kids. So I think what you can do, in just preparation, again, what Rachel said with that front loading, things you can do before the school year would be like mutually agree upon grade check-ins, because there's nothing worse than when you're like, oh, everything's fine, and then you check your grades the month before finals, and you see that it's not what you would like. That can be stressful. So just finding a way to maintain those check-ins, again, in a way that is not punitive, in a way that doesn't feel like surveillance, but in a way that's, again, mutually agreed upon. Also, another thing to mutually agree upon can be like a little help plan. So when things get chaotic, and I'm sure as human beings, we can all relate to this, it's really difficult to be thoughtful. It's difficult to be thoughtful and measured in responses when we're kind of in the heat of the moment. So something that you can start on right now is just like a little plan, a little list of steps that one can take. Like, we can have a plan. Okay, I have a low grade. What are the steps I can do to address it? right? Like I can email the teacher, I can see if there are any office hours opportunities, I can see if, if there's any after school support that my school offers. That can be sort of a procedure. And also with stress, right? If stress is getting to a place that's untenable, what are the steps we can take to kind of get rid of some of that pressure? So again, having that planned out beforehand can be really helpful when you might not have time to really innovate, right? Your kid comes home from school extremely stressed, and it might be a little difficult to sort of think in the moment. And on that, just acknowledge the stress, accept that it is overwhelming. Going from middle school to high school is a lot. It is very different. Especially, I always tell my ninth graders, right? Like, you were the big kid. Like, they were the big kids in middle school. Like, they felt incredibly comfortable. The campus that once seemed big to them when they entered now seems small, and they're thrown into the cycle all over again. Where they're like the babies, right? I always find it like, oh yeah, you'll go to school with people who have like facial hair and like keys to their own cars. And when you're, 14, that's like terrifying. At least it was to me. And I hear that from my students. Something else is really working on systems, both digital and physical. So these systems can be backpack organization techniques, binders, and then of course, like a planner system to stick to. Obviously, if it doesn't work, we can readjust, we can reassess, but trying to find a system that works. And again, being consistent, practicing and rewarding persistence and consistency, I think are all things that can really help your child be prepared.
Interesting. So it really feels like the theme is when you're in elementary, you really want to be involved and supporting them. In middle, you're trying to figure out how much to essentially support them. And then in high school, you just, depending on your situation, of course, you're planning for that independence and treating them as adults and like trying to work on a plan with them that works for both of you versus just imposing something. That's a tough thing for a parent. I'm trying to figure out how I would let my 12-year-old out into the open. I'm like, oh my God, he can't even find his socks in the morning. Like, how is he going to find his classroom? So I agree, like great points. So moving on to the next one, we're going to be back with Rachel again. So obviously every kid learns differently. So specifically what we're asking about while transitioning from lower to upper, you may or may not know that your kid is neurodivergent. You may have a diagnosis, you may not, but in that event, like what should you do to set them up for success, both academically and socially? What are some of the signs that, you should be looking for?
Great questions. And so the first thing I want to start is, especially if you already do have a diagnosis or an IEP, one of the things that you want to do, and actually, no matter what, if there are concerns, definitely talk to the teachers and staff ahead of time, making sure that the people that you're, working with your child know the needs and the accommodations. It could be, what are the triggers? What are the coping strategies? All of those things, and straight down to your basics. These are the accommodations that are in the IEP. It's always good to get, ahead of the game and have that conversation with your child's teacher. Some basics just in general are, making sure you have a routine established, making sure that you're creating that space and fostering those habits that are good, setting up your child for success, in an education setting, but also making sure that success and that conversation regarding education is happening at home. And I'll go into that a little bit more with the next question on practicals for that. When it comes to supporting, your child and making sure they're set up for success academically, you want to make sure that you and the school do have a plan to address those, I want to be specific, but executive function needs. We talked a lot about that, right? What is the plan for organization? What is the schedule? How are we going to help our children with those task initiations and those bigger, as the assignments get bigger in upper elementary, right? How are we going to approach that? I think Giulia talked a little bit about this, but starting those self-regulation strategies that are at home, like mindfulness, meditation, things like that, deep breathing, if you start those ahead of time, then you're going to be able to have just encourage your child to use those both in academic and social challenging situations that might come up. When it comes to academics too, one of the things that I think Suchi has mentioned is just like, what do we do if we suspect, neurodiversity or some challenges, there's a couple of ways to look at this. And one of the things I love this is to notice, right? Trust your gut, trust your instincts. I think sometimes as parents, I know I do this myself, like I go back and forth, but trust your instincts and notice. Is there something going on with your child that is out of the ordinary? Okay. Trust your gut, name it. What are you seeing? What are you thinking? And then like just some examples of what I'm talking about is like, are you noticing your child struggling to sit still? Are you noticing your child struggling with your basic decoding, reading, math, and writing, social issues, anxious or stress? And then the next thing is observe. Watch and observe the behavior, but also keep track of patterns, right? Focus on the behavior you've named. So if it's attention, focus on that, but also keep an eye on other things, because a lot of times we know that these things are embedded in comorbid is what, we use. Take notes on what happens, when and where, and don't try to guess the why. Just track it. Talk with other people who can support your child. And I think this is key to supporting that academic and social success in the school. Your teacher, talk with your child's teacher, talk with your pediatrician, talk with a psychologist, and any other caregivers that are involved in your child's life. And then engage your child. Like this is one thing that we want to have that conversation even at this early age. Just like talking about what's really going on, and making sure that it is the right opportunity or right timing for your child to open up is really important. Telling your child that you want to talk about how things are going, and I always love this, but we want to state our strengths first. Like, yes, that's a trick that teachers do when we talk to parents, but it's a great thing, a great strategy to do as a parent too. And then we talk about the concerns. And then ask your child if there's something they want to share. Okay, just to get that conversation going. It might not be the right time, and that's okay. So you want to provide that reassurance. You can thank them for sharing, but make sure that they know it's okay if they don't want to talk. So those are just some things like, as like you could pick up on those cues if there's something else going on that's bigger. When it comes to social, one of the things I was thinking about too are like, okay, well, we know that a lot of times schools have different like clubs or mentoring programs. Like this is a great idea to help set your, investigate that, see what's in the school, what's in the community, get your kid to know other kids. You can even set up, I know a lot of times people call them play dates or hangout times, where your kids can meet other kids. That will definitely ahead of time before school starts, that'll help set them up for success. Just providing opportunities outside of the school setting to practice those social skills is also really important. And then we know for neurodiverse learners, social stories are always a good opportunity. You can find a lot of them on just how to handle different social situations if you notice those concerns.
If you have any questions on what are social stories, and just feel free to ask us any of that on our socials, and we'll be happy to point you to resources. Thank you so much, Rachel. Do you have just like really quickly, what about folks who have IEPs and 504s? What should they be doing to help make sure that there's continuation of that, with their teachers and the schools, et cetera?
Excellent. I think there's a couple of different things I suggest. First of all, emailing the teacher, making sure that they're aware of it, making that initial point of contact before the school starts. Second of all is monitoring. That could be just making sure you're, engaged with that teacher frequently through email or text, and ask your child. Like they're going to tell you those things that are happening. You may not want to ask like, hey, did you get, extra time on that test? They're going to be like, what do you mean? But just, my child, for example, comes home and is like, I couldn't finish the test again, and so we had to have that conversation. So just be clued in to what those accommodations and supports. And then my first line of action is always go and talk to the teacher first and have that conversation with, okay, how are these, seeking to understand, right? How are these accommodations being put in place? What can we do? Okay, I see there's a need here. And then can we either add it in, or can we make sure that it's happening? So.
And for those who have kids like mine who won't talk at all, and if the answer "how's your day" is just it's fine no matter what, I did find that reaching out to the teachers as a friend, trying to volunteer, front loading,
yes,
hey,
volunteer.
making sure that they're going to get extra time. I mean, it's a little more work, but I think it's important to do that. If not, it's always better to do it ahead of time versus too late. I've done both. So I will definitely say that it's better to plan and do it ahead of time versus being late in the game. The next question, same thing for Dr. Shamey. I do want to add a little twist over here. So the one thing we are getting is of course, what is the best way to set them up? And, anxiety is huge. Mental health is huge. And so there are kids who are struggling to cope with, say, school shootings, or not being in a school that's diverse enough, or, like having, like, not basically looking around and saying, oh, I'm alone. What can we do to help learners and families, who are essentially struggling to figure out how to support them? I think you're on mute again.
I'm so sorry. I keep doing that. I apologize.
That's just because you're excited. We love it. So don't worry.
I am. Reading through this and then listening to you, the middle school is such a rigid structure that I think that's the first thing that comes to my mind in order to set them up for success, is to really help students to understand the rigidity of that structure and help them not mold themselves into it, but just understand it so that they can navigate through their day. Setting them up for success academically, of course, reaching out ahead of time to those teachers, but that's also a different experience. Reaching out to middle school teachers is very different than reaching out to elementary teachers. You may not get the response that you hope for or that you want. You may even get directed to their special education teacher as if it's that someone else's responsibility. And so having those honest conversations to pull those things together and be able to support students is paramount. So to continue to have that conversation with the teacher. Ironically, I never really wanted to read IEPs or 504s or any of that before I met the kids, because I didn't want any of those things to impact my own perceptions, because I sometimes found that some of those documents had things in them that could lead to bias and could lead to assumptions that I might make. So I generally gave myself a couple of weeks, but not everybody is able to do that or should do that, particularly if they struggle with meeting the needs of the students. And so the academic needs in middle school are so overwhelming for 11, 12, and 13-year-olds. And so if you find your student coming home with so much homework, and then you end up battling them every day in order to sit down and finish this homework and finish these tasks, the anxiety and the stress and the depression that will set in as a result of that cycle of going home and having to do all these things that they don't want to do, that they don't find relevant. That's one thing I would caution parents about, is to pay attention to what is that homework that they're doing. Is it something that's relevant? Is it something that's constructive and helpful for the learning of the student? And if not, how do you have that conversation with even the whole teaching team about these things that are expected outside of school? The social pieces of middle school are just difficult and hard to navigate for any student walking through the doors. We go through 5 physiological changes in our lives, and we go through 3 of them in middle school. Middle school kids really have no business in a structure the way that it is. And then if you're neurodivergent and you add that piece and that challenge and that barrier, which shouldn't be a barrier, but is a barrier in the way the system is set up, got to find ways to remove that, and so that students can find that success in school. And going back to the idea of finding that one teacher or that one adult in the building that can help students to advocate for themselves and find those things that they need to be successful, find the social group, find whatever it is. Another thing I was thinking as I was listening to the last answer was the schedule, your student's schedule. Would it be possible? Could you, like, reaching out to the principal? Maybe they have friends from elementary where the transition to middle school would be so much easier if they were in some classes and had some familiar faces. Those are things that can easily be done. Like, to advocate for that when you are the parent of a 6th grader, 7th grader, 8th grader, there's nothing wrong with that. And schools might push back and say, you know, we schedule this is how we do it. They can always do it, and there's always ways to find a structure and a schedule that will meet the needs of individual students.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Giulia, similar theme. It's like obviously school shootings, anxiety, social anxieties that are now affecting learning. It has been, you know, a theme. So what is the best way to set up, you know, middle schoolers who are becoming high schoolers are already scared, and how do we support them in these situations?
Absolutely. There's a lot of anxiety. I think it's just like been, especially like, you know, during the pandemic, I think lots of discussions like rose to salience. Like in talking to a lot, because I primarily teach like upper middle and, you know, high school students. And it's just on the forefront of everyone's mind. So two metaphors, I love my metaphors, my students know this, but two metaphors I love is that like you really can't control the ocean, but you can kind of work on building the ship that you're on. Right. So there are so many uncontrollable factors and we cannot control them, and trying to control them is extremely stressful because it's an impossible task. But we can work on, again, building a stronger boat, which will take me to my next metaphor, which I came up with when one of my students, which makes me feel old somehow, because this kid, I started with her in middle school. She's a junior in college now. And I'm like, wait, what? But she was really nervous to leave for college. And, you know, in talking to her about that transition, I said, listen, like you will change and that's okay. So welcome change, welcome that. But then again, like think about yourself, like you think about your body, like, yes, you will change. The way you look might change. Maybe you have a new haircut, but that skeleton, right? The bones of who you are, you want those to remain solid. So what you can do during this time period is really assist your kid in building a sense of identity by asking them to think about what they value. So really, like, what do you value? What's close to your heart? How do you see yourself? And these are questions that we don't really give kids until and I see this because I also work with kids in college essays, and I'm like, hey, who are you? And the kids are like, stop asking me that. I don't know, but I can tell you about the mitochondria, right? So it's about taking a step back and really powerhouse of the cell, and really hearing them out, you know, when they need to kind of discover themselves, give them the opportunity to discover themselves, you know, encourage them to think about what they value and how those values play out in their lives, especially in meeting friends, right? Where do you want to be in life? And who are the people that you can see by your side in your journey getting there, right? All like tying it back to these values, you know, these bones, if you will. Also encourage your kids to become strong self-advocates, because the world can be a complete storm, but building a ship that knows how to advocate for itself is so important. I always tell my parents of my older kids, let your kids go to those meetings, let your kids voice what they need, because they are the experts on themselves. There is no one who understands their minds, I would say, really better than them. So give them that platform.
That was a total accident. I don't know what happened, so sorry about that. I've been very trigger happy today. Okay, so that's really great, because it's so hard, especially when you're like, I mean, for lack of a better word, like taking care of every detail, you know, because your kid's neurodivergent, you want to protect them. It's like all of a sudden saying, yeah, just let go is kind of like, oh my God, like even I don't know how to do that. So I'm just gonna do it one day at a time. Okay, so this is the last set of